For those of you who don't know me, my name is Joe Nabnitz. I have a bachelor's degree in philosophy from the University of Northern Iowa, and I'm finishing up a degree in psychology right now here at the U. I am not a scholar of Norse mythology. If you happen to be a scholar of Norse mythology in any way, shape, or form, or the Icelandic language, or the Old Norse language, or medieval texts, or whatever, and I say something that's totally wrong, please correct me, because I would rather be right than be wrong. Now, the other thing I am not is a professional lecturer. This is actually the first lecture I've ever given. So, if I start to hyperventilate, please rub my back and tell me it's going to be okay. And if you please, I don't want to just have me talking and reading from slides. Please ask questions, give comments, say things. Yeah, I don't want this to be me talking at you. Yes.
Question, how's the cat doing?
Which one?
All of them.
They're doing fantastic. They're
How many
fat.
cats do you have?
I have 2.
What are their names?
Cat 1 and
They
Cat
are
2.
Fatty Bulger and Madeline Murray O'Hare.
Oh, very good.
Alright, moving on. So, we're going to talk about Norse mythology tonight. This is not your typical talk about Norse mythology. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about specific gods or stories or things like that. Instead, I want to talk more about sort of the primary philosophy and the metaphysics that go into the worldview of the people who actually believe in this religion. My hope is that this will allow us to have some sort of empathy and to gain a better understanding of what their actual worldview was, rather than thinking, haha, look at what these silly forest people believed 1,000 years ago, which is what we tend to do when we talk about actual pagan religions from the past. So, talk overview. We're going to talk about 3 things from the title: Ontology, Metaphysics, and Mythology. So, ontology, the word, means the study of being, right? And so Norse ontology is studying the Norse concept of being, right? How did they see the world and themselves? Camera malfunction. How did they relate to things in the world? How did they see things in the world? How did they see themselves in the world? That's what their ontology is. Their metaphysics are the behind-the-scenes, wheels turning, gears turning of their worldview, which was superstitious, not really supernatural, but it had a lot of interesting metaphysics. And then their mythology is what comes last. That is the stories and the traditions that are derived from the primary principles in order to kind of express their worldview in terms of things in the actual world rather than abstractions. So, learning a mythology is like learning a new language. How many people have learned a second language to an extreme level of proficiency? So you can probably relate when I say that, wow, we have lots of language learners. So it's not just a matter of swapping out the words from the new language with the words from the old language. You have to understand the context, the culture, the history, sort of what it's like to be a person who speaks that language, right? And it's the same thing with any religion, really. You have to, if you really want to understand that, you can't just swap out the gods and the stories and the holidays and say, well, it's just like what I believe, except they worship this god and they have these holidays, when a lot of times religions can be really different, especially with religion like this, which is so far removed from Christianity and monotheism and any sort of religion that we've encountered in the modern world that when we project our own biases onto it, we totally miss the point. So it's also even harder with the Norse religion because they don't exist anymore. We can't go and ask them whether or not we're getting it right. We have to be really, really careful about policing ourselves and seeing whether we're projecting Christian metaphysics, Christian values onto people who lived 1,200, 1,400, 5,000 years ago. So, part 1, who believes in this stuff? Now, the people who believed in this religion were Germanic peoples. This is a modern sort of, what's the word, spread of Germanic peoples now. So you have the English, Germans, Dutch, Austrians, Scandinavians, and way up here you have the Icelanders. In the past, they would have been over here too, into France. The Franks were also Germanic, but these people are bound up by their language. They all speak languages that are in the Germanic language family, by their customs and their social order, and by various artifacts and various stories and religious traditions that they all share or that they all practice in similar ways. I've been talking a lot without taking a breath. What distinguishes Norse mythology from the rest of Germanic mythology is that all of these folks down here, the Germans and the English, they converted to Christianity between the years 400 AD and 600 AD, whereas these people, and those people way over there, converted to Christianity around the year 1000. So you have hundreds of years in which the traditions of the Scandinavians developed on their own into their own separate sort of niche. It's still the same religion, but it developed over 500 years to be something slightly different, slightly their own flavor, and they also managed to write more of it down. The Icelanders especially, around the years 1000 through like the 13th and 14th century, did a ton of writing, and they were really fond of their old traditions and their old stories, so they wrote them down. So that's where we get most of our info on Norse mythology. Yes?
A relevant question. Would you want me to go fill up your water bottle and bring it back?
Yes, please. That would be nice.
That's what
Yes.
I thought.
Semi-relevant question. When Norse mythology was kind of at its peak and when most people who were Germanic believed this, was it similar to Greek mythology insofar as people in Iceland would generally believe in one part of Norse mythology and people in, say, Sweden would believe in an entirely different part of it?
Yes and no. It's hard to say what the peak of Germanic religion was because it was probably practiced for thousands of years before the Romans went north and subdued all of the barbarians into their own sphere of influence. There was definitely, it's in my next slide, the religion was not monolithic. It was highly localized. So this was not a religion where there was a prophet and a central church and a holy book that was handed down from the gods with all the truth in it. This was a bunch of parents telling stories to their children who told these stories to their children, and this happened for years and years, centuries, millennia, probably, as far back as the earliest Indo-Europeans who were like 40,000 years ago, right? So it's developed like a game of telephone. It changes slightly over time such that even though the Greeks and the Germanic peoples have the same ancestors, the Indo-Europeans, by the time they come into contact with each other again, 40,000 years after the fact, they have fairly different expressions of religion. Thank you very much. So, different tribes have their own ancestor gods. So, these gods were not ubiquitous like the Christian God. A lot of these gods are derived from legendary heroes or ancestors of tribes. For example, the Saxons worshipped a god called Saxnit, who no other Germanic tribe worshipped him. He was one of their legendary tribal founders from the beginning. And the Swedes, a lot of the Germanic peoples worshipped Frey, but the Swedes, for some reason, believed that their kings were all descended from Frey. So it could be, there was some king way back when, we don't really know. We have to guess. But no single prophet, no holy book, I already said that. Syncretism. So these people collected gods like people collect Pokemon cards, right? These people did not have any idea the concept of these are the real gods and all other gods are fake. That never occurred to them. They would go to a different country and they would hear, oh, these people worship Jupiter, and they'd say, okay, well, we better worship Jupiter too if we want to do well in this country, right? Be strong here, right? So, for example, the Saxons were, when they originally entered Britain, were clients of the Romans, right? And they thought the Romans were really cool. So they started worshiping Saturn, the Roman god, which is why in English we have Saturday in the middle of all these days named after Germanic gods. Doesn't make any sense, right? Well, they just picked up Saturn because they didn't care. They thought, well, might as well get all the holy help we can, right? So what we do have is not a monolithic religion, but a large number of myths, stories, and depictions of Germanic deities and characters spread out all over Northern Europe, dating from 1,000 years ago to 2,500 years ago, and even further back. They're all vaguely consistent. They have a vaguely similar sort of structure in metaphysics. certain gods appear and reappear, like Frey, Odin, Thor, Freya, Frigg, Tyr, etc. And they all have sort of a family resemblance such that we can say with confidence that these people have the same origins and vaguely follow the same religion, right? So part 2, Norse Ontology. This is where things get really confusing and really difficult. But just try to bear with me. Please ask questions. We're going to get very philosophical in this next portion. So, step 1, forget everything you think you know about Norse mythology, Norse beliefs, Norse gods. On the surface, it appears to be a polytheistic religion where people worship lots of gods, and as people living in a Christian culture, we think lots of gods, so that means their religion was about worshiping gods, right? Wrong! So, instead, we're going to try to find the primary principles of their religion and then derive their gods and their myths from that. So the 2 primary principles of the Norse religion were not worshiping gods, but animism and the metaphor of the well and the tree. So these are both super interesting concepts and are key to understanding sort of where these people were at. So animism. Animism is the belief that everything in nature is alive and has a spirit, that nothing in nature can be truly dead. Every object in nature is part of a process of change and becoming and movement. There's no such thing as a dead resource to be exploited. It's very similar to the, yes?
Do rocks count?
Yes. Rocks, mountains, rivers, holes, oceans.
Holes?
Yeah. Thunder, dead animals, dead people, live people, everything has a spirit to some degree. So the concept of a thing that is totally dead doesn't really make sense to these people because everything has a spirit. So these people had sort of a fear and a respect of things in nature because, if you are not very nice to spirits, they can come up and, totally wreck your shit, right? So it's very similar to Japanese indigenous religion and to some forms of Native American religion. I'd go as far as to say that Japanese Shinto is probably the closest in terms of practice and the way it looks from the outside, probably the closest living religion to old European religion. I think that most forms of modern paganism are not really close, which is fine, they can do whatever they want, but we're not going to get into that can of worms today. Supernatural in this worldview doesn't really exist. So the concept of supernatural is a Christian concept. So let's get a little abstract here. So in Christianity, a primary principle is that God created the world is separate from God, things that are holy are separate from the world is dead matter that is animated by laws, and whenever there are holy things in the world, or events that have spiritual significance, it is God intervening from without, or angels or other supernatural beings coming from without and making a change. For these people, that doesn't make any sense, because everything is spiritual, everything has a spirit, everything is holy, everything in nature can be holy. There is no such thing as a distinction between things that are holy and things that are natural, right? That has pretty strong implications, as you can imagine. So this is a painting by Theodor Kittelsen, one of my favorite painters. He's from Norway, from the late 19th century, and he painted all kinds of pictures like this. So you have this bog, and inside the bog is this lump of grass or seaweed or whatever, and he draws it with little eyes, like it's a kind of a cruel little spirit looking around. It reminds me of something from like a Miyazaki film, where you have these kind of spooky little creatures that look scary, but they're not actually scary, they're just spirits, right? So, it's like a little river spirit. I love Kittelsen. These spirits were sometimes called Alfar, or elves. They had other words for these spirits, but elf is the most fun word. It's important to note that they had all kinds of supernatural, they were not supernatural, that was a total flub on my part. They had all kinds of spirit creatures in their mythology, and the line between them is never drawn clearly. They talk about gods, elves, dwarves, giants, land spirits, land wights, things like that. And there's never a point where these things are defined as separate beings. They kind of are, but not really. Like the dwarves are described as living underground and being ugly and making things with rocks and stuff, but it's never really said what makes a dwarf different from an elf, right?
What exactly is a land wight? Or is that...
It's like a land spirit. The word in Old Norse is landvættir, which I can write on the board. L. A. Right. And that just sort of refers to, we guess it refers to, yes?
Which one's your favorite spirit?
I like the dwarfs, actually. I think elf is the most fun word, but the dwarfs in the myths are really funny. They're ugly and horny, and they are very skilled, and they're always trying to sell their treasures for sexual favors, and they never quite get what they want. It's always really funny. So, and then you have this lovely romantic painting of elves dancing. 80% of Icelanders still believe in elves. This is one of the funniest statistics I think I know. They have an adorable tradition where they build little churches and schools in hills, and they, yes?
Where is that statistic from?
I read it in a very...
On the internet?
I read it in a very recent article, actually. It's not a made-up survey. It was on BBC.
Okay.
But it was part of a documentary. But anyway, they believe that hills and rocks and waterfalls contain elves, and they think it's very dangerous, or very not nice at least, to build buildings over them or build roads through them, because they have this sort of vague idea that these things deserve respect. It's interesting from a cultural standpoint because these people don't believe in elves in the way that the old Norse pagans believed in elves. Not at all. These people are Christians, but they have just this concept of elves, and it's just there, and it's a weird sort of enigmatic thing. Christianity altered the concept of elves and of, animism in general, because Christianity is not compatible with animism. In Christianity, things that are spiritual are separate from the world, right? So how can there be spirits in rocks and trees unless they're demons or devils? So in countries like Germany and in other Germanic countries, I guess, the concept of elves and spirits became demons, or they became these ugly little creatures rather than spirits, right? So very sad. I think animism is very cool. So any questions about animism before we go on to the really, really confusing part?
That's the fun part.
This is, so the well in the tree metaphor is one of the most interesting and difficult metaphors I think I've ever heard. I'm going to try to condense it down to a few slides, and I'm probably going to flub a few things in the process. But just bear with me. It's very, very ontological, not metaphysical. Heidegger wouldn't say it was metaphysical. Anyway, so the well and the tree, two parts. The well of Erd. So the well of Erd is at the base of the tree. The well, now we're not talking about mythology here, we're talking about ontology. The well is everything that is past tense, everything that has already happened, everything that cannot be changed. The past, past deeds, past people, laws of nature, everything that has ever happened, things that can't be changed, including prophecy that is binding or destiny. This is in Norse Ontology, not in not in like my ontology. Just bear with me. So these things come together to form what is called the Erlog, or the over laws of the universe, which are binding on the present moment, that can't be changed. You can't change anything about the past. It's done. It's gone. This is what is in the well. Here's a lovely picture of the well. I think I stole it from DeviantArt. That's the artist's name. I like this picture because it has the three Norns standing around it. The three Norns are kind of misleading because in the myth they're referred to as being called past, present, and future. But honestly, present and future don't have anything to do with the well. This is probably an addition made by later Norse scholars who were learning about Greek mythology at the same time and thought it would be cool if they also had three spinners rather than just one. Another interesting change that Norse scholars made was, after learning about the Trojan War, they started writing Norse history as though Odin and Thor were refugees from the Battle of Troy, and they went to Norway and started the Norse people. Right? So, once again, we don't have a monolithic faith here. A lot of things have changed over time, so you have to kind of take things that are written in the books as, well, this guy wrote it in the 1200s, he was a Christian, he studied the Greeks, etc., etc. But, moving on. So we have the well, the past, this is the tree, the world tree, Yggdrasil. It doesn't look too bad on the projector, I worry it would. Yggdrasil means Odin's horse. One of Odin's many names is Ygg, which means the terrible one. And he's called Odin's horse because he hung himself on the tree for 9 nights and days so that he could learn wisdom. But it's a great story. The tree contains everything that is present tense. Everything that is now, everything that is this exact moment, things that are materially real right now. So think about that in comparison with the past, right? So 5 seconds ago doesn't exist right now, except in that it led up to this moment that exists right now, right? Like it's not a physical object we can reach out and touch. That is what the tree is. Things that are and that must be because of what happened in the past. All that is in the present moment, the past and the future don't exist right now. I already said things. The tree is nourished by the well. It digs its roots into the well of earth and draws nourishment from it. In terms of ontology, it's saying that the present is created by the past. The past fills the present with all of its happenings and creates the moment that we're in right now. What exists right now is the culmination of every single event that has ever happened in the past, right? Like it's not an arbitrary thing that we're all sitting in this room, we're here because we drove here or walked here, we read about the event on Facebook, etc., etc., right? The dew of the tree falls down and replenishes the well. So, ontically, the present moment slips into the past. It becomes a part of the total past, the heirloom. And the future is created by what happens in the present as it turns into the past and creates the next moment of time, right? So, I apologize for the grotesque paint illustration I'm about to show. But, so, you have the well goes up and creates the tree, and then the dew of the tree falls down into the well. So, pretty straightforward. Well, not really straightforward. Kind of a difficult metaphor. Before we go on, is that clear? Anybody have any questions?
So the past creates the future because you're bound by what happened in the past for the future?
No.
Or?
The past doesn't create the future, the past creates the present.
But the past is going up the tree.
Yeah. So the past creates the present, which is the tree.
Oh, okay.
And then the present falls down into
okay,
the
so
past.
the present, okay, I thought the present was the tree, the dew is the future.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, no, the dew is the present turning into the past.
Where's the future?
There is no future. There is no future. In Germanic languages, in all Germanic languages, even English now, there is no future tense. Okay? In Romance languages, there is a future tense. You can talk about things happening in the future. But in Germanic languages, you can't. The closest you can do is use helping verbs. You can say it will happen, or it shall happen, or it must happen. But you can't say, it is happening in the future in the same way that you can in a Romance language. So like for these people, the future was not a thing that already existed in a way. Everything was the present and the past. The tree and the well, right? So this has huge implications on their psychology and their philosophy, right? So they have an intense reverence for the past, their ancestors, their tribal founders and heroes, the gods, their parents, everything that is in the past, they revere. Because the people in the past created the present moment and gave them everything that they have. Everything they have, they owe to their forebears. These people didn't worship the gods in everyday life so much as they worshipped their ancestors or heroes. They would make offerings and libations to their parents, their grandparents, to lost children, things like that. They worshipped the past. These were not forward-thinking people, these were backward-thinking people in the most literal sense of the saying, right? Brandon?
I take it they didn't worship living parents then, only after you're dead? Or?
Yeah, after they're dead.
Okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, so I know I kind of have an idea of what apocalypse is to the Christian religion, but if these people are so focused on the past, was their Ragnarok really that similar, or was it seen as very different?
I have a slide about Ragnarok later in the talk. We'll talk about it more then, but I will say that Ragnarok is not quite what we think it is in the common sense. It's not just a doomsday apocalypse. It is also a metaphor for everything that ends and starts anew as part of the cycle. So, like, we'll talk about that a little more later. But,
I blame Marvel.
yeah, I mean, Marvel ruined a lot of things. But, did you have your hand up, Drew? No?
Yep.
They were constantly alluding to the past and past events in traditional speech. These were people who talked in metaphors, in just strings and strings of metaphors that are so confusing if you don't know what they're referring to that it makes no sense. For example, in Egil's saga, which is an Icelandic saga, Egil loses his son in a boating accident, and he's very upset. Because not only did his son die, but he died in a boring, pointless way, in a boating accident, not in battle or doing anything great. And so he reproaches Odin for giving him such a horrible fate and stealing his son. And in this letter, he writes like 2 paragraphs, and he refers to Odin probably 20 times in these 2 paragraphs, and he never uses the word Odin. He refers over and over again. He who hung on the tree, Mimir's friend, he who has one eye, all these allegories. And if you don't know these stories, you're like, who's he talking about? How many people is he mad at? And they also wrote this way about their sagas and their legendary heroes, characters like Völand the Smith, and people like that. They were real to them in the sense that they were part of the past that gave them the present that they lived in. This also influenced their view of social class and order. These people believed that the reason that someone was a king or a peasant farmer or a thrall was because of everything that happened in the past. It was not injustice, it was everything happening as it should because of all the things that happened in the past. So they had a very sort of accepting view of their social class structure, which was pretty straightforward. They had kings, peasants, and thralls, slaves, right? Their view of death and a good life is also very profoundly influenced by this. So the most important poem in the Old Norse sources is the Haldamál. And this particular pair of stanzas probably sums up the Norse view of life better than anything else. We actually know, because thanks to Snorri, sort of what this would have sounded like if someone had sang it as the traditional oral traditions would have been passed on. So I'm actually going to sing it for you, as it may have sounded 1,200 or maybe 2,000 years ago.
Woo!
So glad we're recording this.
It would have sounded like this. Deir fe, deia frender, deir tjalver sama, en odsir aldrei, vem sér golden geter. Deir fe, deia frender, deir tjalver sama, ek veit ei not aldrig deir, domer deg dan fer. Thank you. So this poem, before I go on, this poem, it was written down in the 9th century, in like 872 or something like that. But some of the words from these stanzas are as old as 2,500 years. There's a rune stone from the 4th century BC that has the phrase in sort of an older Proto-Germanic, "Der Friede Freunde," right? And like that's crazy, right? Someone passed that down for over 1,000 years, such that in the 8th century, someone was still writing it down and still enjoying it. I think that's cool. But anyway, this poem means as such, and I translated it myself. I can't actually speak Old Norse. This translation is based on comparing different translations. But cattle die, friends die, you yourself die just the same. But there's one thing that never dies, the reputation a man has earned. I really screwed that. Oh, anyway. Cattle die, friends die, you yourself die just the same. I know one thing that never dies, the doom of each dead man. So what is doom? What is doom? Nowadays, when we use the word doom, we mean everything's going wrong, everything's failing. But prior to like 50 years ago, the word doom in English referred to destiny, or someone's end, like the culmination of someone's life. In The Lord of the Rings, Frodo says several times that it's his doom to take the ring to Orodruin, the Fire Mountain. And it always confused me when I was a kid. Like, what is he talking about? What's a doom? But then, later on I learned better. So, death in the Norse faith. I'm going to talk about doom on the next slide. So, these people were obsessed with death. Death was an ever-looming prospect in their life. They were hyper-conscious of the fact that they were all going to die and that was their fate. There was no way around it. There is no eternity. These people did not believe in an afterlife that went on forever and ever after they died. Martin Heidegger once said, famously, when asked by a student how to live life more authentically, that we should spend more time in graveyards. By that he meant we should spend more time thinking about the fact that we're going to die, right? He would have loved these people. These people, their philosophy is strikingly similar to his, I think. Death was all around them. They lived in one of the most brutal climates in the entire world. People froze to death every winter, starved to death every summer, died in battles over petty land disputes. Like, people died all the time, right? And every person knew that they were going to die. There was no getting around it. You were dead. Sorry. Even the gods themselves were going to die someday as part of their mythical cycle. Nothing is forever. So the doom of each man, each dead man, as recorded in that poem, is that everyone is going to die, right? So it's commonly believed that the Norse people believed in total predestination, like their life was a book that was already written and they had no hand in traversing the pages, right? But that's not really quite true. They believed that they must die and that was their fate. But that's about as far as their predestination goes. What's really true is that they saw their destiny, their ultimate death, as something that was caused by everything that happened in the past. Their death was the culmination of their life. And so how they died was really important, right? Because if you died some lame death, or if you were, killed by your own brother, or if you died with stains on your reputation, that meant you had screwed up your own life, right? And they took that very seriously. The worst insult that you could possibly give someone, if you were a Norse pagan in 8th century Norway, was to call them a nithing. To call them nothing. Say, no reputation, no friends, no family, no good deeds to your name, you're nothing. That was the worst thing you could possibly say to somebody, right? So our actions, I should have said their actions, but our actions can influence the future even after we die through our legacy, through children we leave behind, through friends we leave behind, through things we do that impact the lives of others, right? So by living well in accordance with one's ideals, striving for greatness, one can leave behind a legacy that is great and glorious and that impacts the world in a way that people sing about you for centuries to come. This is not just nice people. This is people who do things that are incredible, even things that we, with our modern sensibilities that are so enlightened, think are bad. People like Attila the Hun, for example, has his own Norse saga, which is interesting because the discrepancies between his Norse saga and the Romans' account of him are very different. Anyway, so these people had what was called the heroic mindset. Now, this is especially true of the Icelanders and of the adventurers, the Vikings who traveled all over the place. They believed that they had a choice in how they dealt with their death. Would they hide from it? Would they cower at home while all their friends went raiding and live peaceful lives? Or would they face their death with courage and do something worthwhile? Right? One of the other stanzas from the Havamal says, to paraphrase, that no matter how old you get, even if you hide from fighting, you'll still feel the aches and pains of old age. So you're not really going to be any better off, except that your reputation will suck. right? So to face death with courage, to do deeds that may lead to death, is heroic, as long as you're standing up for the ideals that are called good by your tribe or your family or by you, right? So to live as an image of your own ideals and to die as an image of your own ideals was the best possible death, or the best possible life. And the best possible death was more important than the best possible life, really. King Theoden in The Lord of the Rings is a great example of a heroic character. So it's not really the same in the movies, but in the books, he's challenged. He wants to stay in Aedoras and hide while they're fighting this battle at the gates of Minas Tirith, because he's afraid that they're going to die. He doesn't know what to do. And then he realizes that if he stays and hides, he might live a little longer, but he'll probably still die. So he decides to ride to certain death with all of his warriors, and he stands in front of the armies of Mordor and he says, ride to ruin and the world's ending. It's not just bravado. He's saying, we're all going to die, but it's okay because we're dying a good way, right? And then when he dies on the battlefield, we don't feel bad for him. At least I don't feel bad for him, because he died the best possible death. He died as a hero, right? So that's the heroic mindset, to uphold your ideals regardless of the fact that life seems pointless. So it's also easy to become a nihilist when you realize that you're going to die. Be like, man, I'm going to die, life's pointless, I'm just going to inject heroin into my eyeballs until right? But to conquer that and say, no, my life's not pointless because I'm going to make it not pointless, that's another way to be heroic, to uphold your ideals in the face of certain death. So that is part one. That is the ontology. How are we doing? Questions, concerns? Alex.
You turn me on. It's concerning.
Have you ever actually heard of anyone shooting heroin into their eyeballs?
Only on the internet.
Well, believe the internet. If you do one thing in life, believe the internet.
Wise man once told me. So now we're going to talk about Norse mythology. So with these primary principles in mind, we'll think about how they derive their stories for how the world works. And then we have this glorious picture of Thor, tiny Thor, battling the world serpent, Jormungand. So let's take an imaginary trip to 7th century Norway. So imagine you are a peasant farmer in Norway in the 7th century. It's chilly even in the summer. You're desperately dependent on nature. The sun, the rain, planting harvest, the sea. If any of these things go wrong, you're going to die. All your kids are going to die. Nobody's going to like you. It's going to be terrible, right? You're also desperately struggling against the elements. Brutal winters, cold winds, droughts, long nights. In some places in Norway, the sun disappears for weeks at a time in the middle of winter. Like, if you're a superstitious person in the 7th century who's already practicing all these religious rituals, this fact alone has really interesting implications. The sun disappears, and you don't know when it's going to come back. Like, scary as hell, right?
Right.
No. So some of these forces of nature are good. They help you survive and establish your community. The rain, the thunder that comes with the rain and signifies it. If you're a sailor and you have a nice breeze that sends you in the direction you need to go. Fertile ground, growing crops, things like that. These are the Aesir, or the gods. And there's this adorable picture of all of them. They're so cute. My favorite is Heimdall with his horn. So, the gods represent, in general, forces of nature that humans can have good relations with, right? Things that people depend on and would, ask for help or desire their help so that they could, grow their crops or win their battles or whatever. Different groups or classes of people would worship different gods. People didn't have, a stockpile of all the different gods in their house so that they could make sure to worship all of them. For example, if you were a farmer, you probably worshiped Frey, because Frey was the one who made the ground fertile by impregnating it with his giant phallus. If you were a warrior or a poet or a scholar, you'd probably worship Odin, because not only was he the god of wisdom, but he was also the god of war and death and of fate, of important events. If you were a king, you wanted Odin to give you his blessing so that you could win and become the next great leader. But he might also betray you and help another person win, but we'll talk about that in the next slide. Freya was basically, this has to do sort of with his association with fate, I think. Fate and sort of natural laws and order, which is what all the Aesir represent, are things that create order and that help people out, right? He sits on a magic chair where he can see everything in the world that is happening on the world tree, and he has two magic ravens who fly around the world and steal secrets and bring them back to him. So, like, he wants knowledge more than anything else. He gave one of his eyes, he pulled it out and put it into the well of Mim to take a draught of his mead of wisdom, but that's another story. Yeah, so he's a scary god, but we don't know if that's what people actually thought of him in the past. Balder, the son of Odin, associated with beauty and the sun. The world weeps when he dies because he is so loved and so handsome. The sun association is especially important here. A note on practice. Deities are worshipped and given rituals when it was necessary, blah, 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 and the primary object of daily worship were ancestors, founders, tribal heroes, etc. For example, in England, in Sussex, there's a stone called the White Horse Stone. That stone is a stone where people made sacrifices to the Saxon hero Hrossa, who is one of the first heroes of their migration to England. And people made sacrifices there as far as like the 14th century. It had changed dramatically over time, but yeah.
What did the sacrifices look like? Would it ever be human sacrifice?
No, it would be like people would leave food there, or pour libations, or they would sacrifice small animals or whatever. Human sacrifice, the only recorded instance is at the festival of Uppsala, where they sacrificed nine of every living thing, which was like 9 of every sort of typical farm animal, and then 9 people. We don't know exactly why, but we could have been many reasons or ideas behind it. So some forces of nature were not so nice. These were the giants, or the Jotuns, or the Ettins. I like the term Ettin the most because I think it makes the most sense in light of what they do. So in England, the word Ettin was actually banned, and so the word giant sort of took its place. The name means devourer. They were devourers of order. They destroyed order and caused it to devolve into chaos. That was sort of their function. They represent more treacherous forms of nature, like the winter and glaciers and brutal seas and crashing waves, things like that. They weren't evil, just like the gods aren't good. They were just capricious and more dangerous, right? Not all giants were bad. There's a cute picture of Aegir, but some of the giants were friends or allies or parents or spouses of the Aesir. Some of the Aesir were former giants who just joined the Aesir tribe. Aegir and Ron, this is Aegir. I thought one of these was Ron, but now I see there's 2 sort of things in the water. I don't know. They had the Aesir over for dinner, for feasts. They were pals. Some giants became Aesir, like Skadi, who became Njord's wife. Like the Aesir, the Ettins are nature spirits. They just are of another tribe, and they hate the Aesir, right? So all these spirits are kind of bound together by what it is to be a spirit, right? And then they just sort of assume different forms. So, Ragnarok, the end. So, even the gods must die. Everyone knows this myth to some degree. You have, the world's serpent and all the gods and giants fighting. That's a really glorious picture. I'm glad I found it. Some deviant art person, I don't even know. This myth, like all other myths, is cyclical and multidimensional. So it's a mistake with any of these myths to assume that it refers to one story or one thing or one event, because all of these myths are not so much telling a story like Christian myths, where it's a timeline from beginning to present. They are descriptive of things in nature, of natural cycles, of rituals that people perform, things like that. The metaphor extends to many areas of life, not just the end of the world. It could refer to the end of a kingdom, or the end of a person's life, the end of a business, the end of anything, really. So this is a really interesting concept that I'm not going to talk too long about. So myth is usually created to describe a ritual. What does that mean? So a major sort of assumption in folklore studies is that when myths are created, the myth isn't created first. The myth is created to describe something that people already do. For example, people have been giving each other presents and hanging up evergreen trees on the winter solstice for probably 3 to 40,000 years. We don't know how long. But only recently did we decide that we give each other presents because of Santa and Christmas elves, right? We kind of derived new myths to explain why we do the things we do. And it's the same thing with Norse myths. It's probably the case that this story was made to describe something that they already did, that was created in some past so far gone that they can't access it or can't know the original intention. So, in the Norse worldview, every